Picture this: September 2024, Flathead Lake, Montana. Two recreational scuba divers from Missoula are exploring a section of the lake known for its dramatic underwater terrain. Steep drop-offs where the bottom plunges from shallow to deep within yards. They're diving at approximately 16 feet, following a rocky ledge, when they see something that makes them stop mid-kick and signal each other urgently. Partially buried in silt, covered in decades of algae growth, but unmistakably man-made, is a vehicle. Not a modern car that rolled in recently, but something older, much older, with a distinctive boxy shape that any military history enthusiast would recognize immediately. It's a Jeep Willys, the iconic military vehicle of World War II, sitting upright on the lake bottom, as if someone had simply parked it there 75 years ago and walked away. The olive-drab paint is faded almost to nothing, the metal is corroded, but the structure is remarkably intact. And when the divers shine their lights through what remains of the windshield, they see something that transforms this from a fascinating discovery into a tragedy. Skeletal remains behind the steering wheel, still in the driver's position. Hands on a steering wheel that hasn't turned in 3/4 of a century. Within hours, the Flathead County Sheriff's Department has secured the site and brought in specialized recovery teams. The Jeep's license plate, though corroded, is readable: Montana 72947. A check against historical vehicle registration records, painstakingly preserved in state archives, reveals a name that older residents of Kalispell still remember: Ryan Garcia, a 29-year-old World War II veteran who left his apartment on the evening of October 5, 1949, to drive to his fiancée's house for dinner and was never seen again. For 75 years, Ryan Garcia's disappearance has been one of Montana's enduring mysteries. His family believed he'd gotten cold feet about his upcoming wedding and run away. His fiancée spent decades torn between grief and anger, never knowing if the man she loved had abandoned her or met with tragedy. And all that time he was right there, just 16 feet below the surface of Flathead Lake, in a section where thousands of boaters, swimmers, and fishermen have passed overhead, completely unaware of what the cold Montana water was hiding. If you're drawn to stories where assumptions shape decades of grief, where heroes survive war only to be claimed by circumstance, then subscribe right now. Hit that button and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to share is a story that will break your heart and make you question how easily we judge the missing. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this discovery has forced an entire community to confront 75 years of misunderstanding, and why sometimes the truth is closer than anyone imagined. The question isn't just how Ryan's Jeep ended up in Flathead Lake. The question is, why did everyone assume he'd run away when the answer was just feet from the shore? Ryan Garcia was 29 years old in the fall of 1949, and everything about him reflected the quiet strength of men who'd seen too much, too young, and come home determined to build something better. Standing at 5'10" with the lean, muscular build that came from military service and physical labor, Ryan had the weathered look of someone older than his years. His black hair was always kept military short, though he'd been out of the Army for 4 years. His dark brown eyes had a distant quality that people who knew him recognized as the 1,000-year stare. That look combat veterans carried, seeing things others couldn't see, remembering things they couldn't forget. His hands told the story of his life. They were calloused and scarred, marked by war and by the work he'd done since coming home. He had a distinctive scar across his left palm from shrapnel at Normandy, a permanent reminder of June 6, 1944, the day that had shaped everything that followed. His fingers were stained with motor oil that never quite washed out, evidence of his work as a mechanic at Thompson's garage in Kalispell. Born in 1920 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ryan had grown up in a family that had migrated north during the Depression, settling in Montana in 1935 when work in the copper mines offered hope. He'd graduated from Kalispell High School in 1938, worked odd jobs for a few years, and enlisted in the Army in September 1942 at 22, when it became clear the war wouldn't end quickly and every able man was needed. He'd spent 3 years in Europe, landing at Normandy in the first wave, fighting through France and Belgium, surviving the Battle of the Bulge in winter 1944 to 1945, and finally being part of the forces that pushed into Germany in the war's final months. He'd earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and sergeant's stripes. He'd also earned nightmares that woke him sweating and gasping, memories that made sudden loud noises send him diving for cover, and a deep appreciation for the quiet, ordinary life that so many people took for granted. Ryan returned to Kalispell in August 1945, 25 years old, but feeling decades older. He moved into a small apartment above a hardware store on Main Street, took the job at Thompson's garage, and slowly, carefully tried to build a normal life. He was good with engines, could diagnose problems by sound, could fix almost anything mechanical. The work was soothing in its way, concrete problems with tangible solutions, so different from the chaos and uncertainty of combat. His pride and joy was the 1943 Jeep Willys he'd purchased in 1946 from Army surplus. Thousands of Jeeps had been sold to civilians after the war, and for veterans like Ryan, owning one felt right. This was a vehicle he understood, that he'd driven in combat, that represented a piece of his experience that didn't involve blood and death. He'd restored it carefully, keeping the olive drab paint, maintaining it to military standards, treating it with the same meticulous care he'd learned in the service. Eleanor Patterson had met Ryan at a church social in the spring of 1948. She was 25 then, working as a secretary at the Flathead County Courthouse, living with her parents on the north side of Kalispell. Petite at 5'3", with auburn hair and green eyes, Eleanor had a gentle manner that seemed to soothe Ryan's war-wound soul. She didn't push him to talk about what he'd experienced, didn't demand explanations for the times he went quiet and distant, understood that some things couldn't be spoken. Their courtship was slow and careful, two cautious people building something they both hoped would last. By the summer of 1949, Ryan had proposed and Eleanor had accepted. They'd planned a wedding for November 12, 1949, just over a month out from that October evening when everything would change. Eleanor's mother had already made the dress. Ryan had saved enough for a down payment on a small house on the edge of town. They'd talked about children, about building the kind of family and life that the war had taught Ryan to value above everything. What made Ryan special to those who knew him was his reliability. War had taught him the importance of showing up, of keeping your word, of being someone others could count on. He was never late, he never canceled plans. If Ryan Garcia said he'd be somewhere, he'd be there, even if he had to walk through a blizzard to make it. This absolute dependability was why his disappearance, when it came, was so incomprehensible to everyone except his family, who'd begun to whisper about wedding jitters and cold feet. The Garcia family had concerns about the marriage, not about Outlaword, who they liked, but about whether Ryan was ready. He still had nightmares. He still went distant and unreachable. He drank more than he should, though he was never violent or mean, just quiet and sad. His younger sister, Maria, 22 in 1949, worried that Ryan was trying to build a normal life before he dealt with the war that was still fighting inside him. But Ryan insisted he was fine. The wedding plans continued, and on the afternoon of October 5, 1949, a Wednesday, Ryan left work at Thompson's garage at 5:30 p.m. as scheduled, climbed into his Jeep Willys, and headed toward Eleanor's parents' house for dinner. It was a drive he'd made dozens of times, about 12 miles from his apartment, following the road that curved along the eastern shore of Flathead Lake, then turning inland toward the Patterson property. October 5, 1949 had been unseasonably cold, with temperatures in the low 30s and a storm system moving in from the north. The forecast called for the first significant snow of the season, possibly several inches overnight. But at 5:30 p.m. when Ryan left work, it was just cold and gray, no precipitation yet, conditions that any Montana native knew how to handle. Ryan was in good spirits that day, according to his co-workers. He joked about Eleanor's mother's cooking, said he was looking forward to the pot roast she'd promised. He told his boss, Harold Thompson, that he'd be in early the next morning to finish a repair job on a truck. There was no indication of distress, no sign that anything was wrong. He'd simply gotten in the Jeep and driven away, waving to Harold as he left. The route Ryan took followed Highway 35, a two-lane road that hugged Flathead Lake's eastern shore for several miles. The road was paved but narrow, with minimal shoulder and no guardrails in most sections. Drop-offs to the lake were steep in places, and the water came close to the road in several locations. It was a scenic drive in good conditions, but it required attention, particularly as darkness fell, and particularly if weather turned bad. Around 6:15 p.m., the snow started. Not gradually, but suddenly, the way mountain storms often do. Within minutes, it was falling heavily, driven by wind that had picked up out of nowhere. Visibility dropped rapidly. The temperature plunged. Roads that had been merely cold became slick with accumulating snow. Eleanor Patterson expected Ryan at 6:30 p.m. When 7 p.m. came with no Ryan and no phone call, she felt the first stirrings of concern. By 7:30 p.m., she was calling his apartment. No answer. By 8 p.m., she'd called Thompson's garage, but the garage was closed and no one answered. By 8:30 p.m., Eleanor's father, James Patterson, was driving the route Ryan should have taken, looking for any sign of the Jeep or an accident. James drove slowly through the snowstorm, which had intensified into a blizzard, searching as best he could. He made it all the way to Kalispell, seeing no sign of Ryan's Jeep on the main highway. He checked Thompson's garage, where the Jeep wasn't parked. He checked Ryan's apartment, where the landlord confirmed Ryan had left hours earlier. James drove back to his house, finding nothing, increasingly worried as the storm made searching more difficult with each passing hour. By 9:30 p.m. on October 5, 1949, Eleanor's family called the Flathead County Sheriff's Department to report Ryan Garcia missing. The deputy who took the call noted the storm conditions and suggested Ryan might have pulled over to wait it out, might be at a friend's house, might show up soon with an explanation. But he also noted Ryan's military reliability, the fact that he'd never been late before, and agreed that deputies would start looking as soon as conditions allowed. October 6th dawned cold and white. The storm had deposited 8 inches of snow across the Flathead area overnight, and temperatures had dropped to the teens. Search operations began at first light. Deputies and volunteers checking the route Ryan should have taken, looking for any sign of the olive-drab Jeep Willys or tracks leading off the road. They found nothing. The fresh snow had covered everything. If Ryan had gone off the road during the early stages of the storm, his tracks were buried under 8 inches of powder. If the Jeep had slid into a ditch somewhere, it was hidden under snowdrifts. The search expanded to include side roads, alternate routes, any place Ryan might have gone if he'd tried to avoid the storm. Days passed. The investigation revealed nothing. Ryan's Jeep seemed to have vanished as completely as he had. His apartment showed no signs of planning to leave. His belongings were all there. His savings account contained the money he'd been saving for the house, untouched. His paycheck from Thompson's garage, which he'd cashed that afternoon, was missing. But Ryan always carried his week's pay in his wallet, so that proved nothing. Theories emerged, and they divided along family lines. The Garcia family, particularly Maria, began suggesting that Ryan had gotten cold feet. The wedding was just 5 weeks away. Ryan had been showing signs of stress. Maybe he'd driven away that night and just kept driving, unable to face the commitment, overwhelmed by expectations he couldn't meet. It wasn't what they wanted to believe, but it seemed more likely than a simple accident that left no trace. Eleanor and her family rejected this theory. Absolutely. Ryan loved Eleanor. He was excited about the wedding, about their future. He'd been planning, preparing, talking about their life together. Eleanor insisted something terrible had happened, that Ryan would never voluntarily disappear, that there had to be another explanation. The sheriff's investigation found no evidence of foul play, no indication of criminal activity. Ryan had no enemies, no debts, no problems that would make him a target. The only mystery was his complete disappearance, his Jeep's complete disappearance, and the total lack of any trace despite intensive searching. By November 1949, when the wedding should have happened, the case was effectively cold. Ryan Garcia was listed as missing, presumed to have left voluntarily, though there was no proof. Eleanor, devastated and confused, canceled the wedding she'd spent months planning. The dress her mother had made hung in a closet unworn. The house Ryan had planned to buy went to another couple. The 1950s arrived, and post-war America moved forward. Eleanor Patterson eventually began dating again, though friends said part of her never quite let go of Ryan Garcia. She married in 1954, a quiet ceremony, to a kind man who understood he'd always be second to a ghost. She had children, built a life, but she never forgot the veteran who'd driven away into a snowstorm and never returned. The Garcia family dealt with their own complicated grief. Maria married and moved to Seattle, but she carried guilt for suggesting her brother had run away. Ryan's parents died in the 1960s, never knowing what happened to their son. The family narrative hardened over time. Ryan had gotten scared, had left to avoid marriage, had started over somewhere else. It was easier than accepting that their reliable, strong brother might have died alone on a Montana road. Flathead Lake remained what it had always been, a beautiful body of water attracting tourists and recreationalists. Highway 35 along Flathead Lake was improved over the decades, widened, guardrails installed, the dangerous sections made safer. The area where Ryan Garcia had actually gone into the water changed completely, developed with houses and boat launches that hadn't existed in 1949. Eleanor Patterson Morrison died in 2017 at age 94. In her final years, with dementia stealing her memories, she'd sometimes ask about Ryan, about when he was coming for dinner, reverting to that October evening when she'd waited for a man who never arrived. Her children had learned the story, but to them it was ancient history, a sad tale from before they were born. Maria Garcia Hernandez was 97 years old in 2024, living in a nursing home in Seattle. She had a few lucid days each month, and on those days she'd sometimes talk about her brother Ryan, about wondering where he'd gone, whether he'd ever thought about the family he'd left behind. The guilt had never completely faded. And then, on that September day in 2024, two divers exploring Flathead Lake's underwater terrain made a discovery that would rewrite 75 years of family history and community assumptions. The recovery operation took careful planning. At 16 feet, the Jeep was accessible to recreational divers, but extracting it required heavy equipment and expertise. Over a week in late September, specialized crews worked to prepare the vehicle for lifting, stabilizing the corroded metal, ensuring that evidence was preserved. On October 1, 2024, the Jeep Willys broke the surface of Flathead Lake for the first time since October 5, 1949. Water streamed from every opening, decades of accumulated silt sliding off the metal. The crowd gathered on shore, including reporters, law enforcement, and descendants of people who'd known Ryan Garcia, watched in silence as history literally surfaced. The forensic examination revealed details that finally explained what happened 75 years earlier. The Jeep showed no signs of mechanical failure, the steering intact, the brakes functional given the corrosion. What it showed was impact damage consistent with leaving a road at moderate speed and entering water nose first. The skeletal remains in the driver's seat were confirmed through dental records as Ryan Garcia. The cause of death appeared to be drowning, no evidence of trauma beyond what would be expected from a vehicle accident. In the Jeep, investigators found Ryan's wallet, containing his driver's license, $43 in 1949 currency, and a photograph of Eleanor. They found the engagement ring he'd been planning to give her that night, even though they were already engaged, an upgrade he'd saved for. Most heartbreaking was a letter found in the glove compartment, written by Ryan but never sent, addressed to Eleanor, dated October 4, 1949, the day before he disappeared. In it, he wrote about his fears, about whether he deserved happiness after the things he'd done and seen in the war, about whether he could
be the husband she deserved. But the letter concluded with determination. I'm going to try. You make me believe I can be whole again. I'll see you tomorrow for dinner. I love you always, Ryan. The investigation reconstructed what happened on October 5, 1949. Ryan, driving along Highway 35 as the snowstorm hit, had been navigating carefully through rapidly deteriorating conditions. At a particular section of road where it curved close to the lake, a section with no guardrail and a steep drop-off, something had gone wrong. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind, perhaps ice forming on the road faster than expected, perhaps a moment of distraction or a mechanical response that went wrong. The Jeep had left the road, traveled down the embankment, and entered Flathead Lake. The water there dropped off quickly, 16 feet deep within yards of the shore. The Jeep, heavy with its military construction, had sunk rapidly. Ryan, possibly stunned by the impact, possibly unable to open the door against water pressure, had drowned as the vehicle filled. It had settled on the lake bottom, and there it had remained for 75 years, in water cold enough and deep enough to preserve it, but shallow enough that modern divers could eventually find it. Why hadn't searchers in 1949 found it? The answer lay in the timing and conditions. The Jeep had gone into the water during the early stage of the snowstorm, before the heaviest accumulation. Any tracks it left were covered within an hour. The search that began the next morning looked for vehicles on roads or in roadside ditches, not in the lake 16 feet down. The section of shoreline where Ryan entered the water was steep and rocky, not a place that seemed likely for a vehicle accident. And 1949 technology couldn't search underwater effectively. No sonar, no underwater cameras, no way to see what the lake was hiding. Maria Garcia Hernandez received the news on October 2, 2024. Her daughter called from Seattle, told her they'd found Uncle Ryan. Maria, 97 and frail, wept for the brother she'd wrongly accused of abandoning his family. I thought he ran away, she told investigators who came to interview her. I told people he got scared of the wedding. I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Ryan. I was wrong. Eleanor's children, now in their 60s and 70s, learned that the man their mother had waited for had never abandoned her. He died trying to reach her, killed by weather and circumstance and bad luck. The narrative they'd been told about the soldier who got cold feet and ran was false. Their mother had been right all along to believe Ryan wouldn't have left voluntarily. The discovery forced the community to confront how easily they'd accepted the abandonment theory. Ryan Garcia, reliable and steady, who'd never missed an appointment in his life, had been assumed to have done exactly what would have been most out of character. Because it seemed more plausible than a disappearance with no trace, people had believed the explanation that fit their expectations rather than the one that fit the evidence. Ryan Garcia was laid to rest in November 2024, 75 years after he should have been married. The service was held at the same church where his wedding was supposed to take place.
His nephew, Maria's son, now 72 years old, spoke about an uncle he'd never met, but whose story had shaped his family's history. Veterans organizations honored Ryan's service, his Bronze Star and Purple Heart displayed beside his flag-draped coffin. The Jeep Willys, after forensic examination, was partially restored by a military vehicle preservation group. It will be displayed at the Montana Historical Society, a memorial to Ryan Garcia and to all the veterans who survived war only to be claimed by the peacetime world they returned to. Highway 35 along Flathead Lake now has guardrails at every dangerous section, modern safety features that didn't exist in 1949. But there's a small memorial marker near where Ryan's Jeep entered the water, acknowledging the veteran who died there and reminding travelers that even familiar roads can be deadly when conditions change. So what really happened on October 5, 1949? The evidence provides a clear answer. Ryan Garcia, driving to his fiancée's house for dinner, was caught in a sudden, severe snowstorm. On a section of road with no guardrail and a steep drop to the lake, his Jeep left the pavement and entered Flathead Lake. The vehicle sank quickly, and Ryan drowned before he could escape. It was a tragic accident, nothing more and nothing less. But assumptions turned it into something else for 75 years. The real tragedy extends beyond Ryan's death. It's in the 75 years that his family believed he'd abandoned them, that they carried shame, thinking he'd run from responsibility. It's in Eleanor spending her life torn between love and anger, never knowing whether to grieve or to resent. It's in the community's willingness to believe the worst about a man whose entire life had demonstrated reliability and honor. Ryan Garcia survived D-Day, survived the Battle of the Bulge, survived 3 years of combat in Europe. He came home, rebuilt his life, found love, planned a future, and he died on a Montana road, killed by weather and geography and bad timing. His death hidden by assumptions and a lake that kept it secret for 3/4 of a century. For Maria Garcia Hernandez, who died peacefully in December 2024, just 2 months after her brother was found, the discovery brought guilt and relief in equal measure. She'd spent 75 years believing a lie about her brother, but she'd gotten to know the truth before she died. She'd gotten to say she was sorry. And in her final days, she'd told her family that Ryan had finally come home. Eleanor Patterson Morrison had died 7 years too early to know the truth, but her children found some peace in learning that their mother had been right, that the love she'd carried for Ryan Garcia her entire life had been based on truth rather than delusion. The wedding that never happened was honored at Ryan's funeral. Eleanor's wedding dress, preserved for 75 years, placed on display beside his flag. If you have information about other missing persons, particularly older cases where assumptions have shaped the narrative, authorities encourage you to come forward. Technology has advanced to the point where cases unsolvable in the 1940s can now be resolved. Every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves the truth. Ryan Garcia was 29 years old when he died, a veteran who'd given everything for his country and was trying to build a life worthy of what he'd survived. He deserved better than to spend 75 years at the bottom of a lake while his family carried shame. But at least now the truth is known. At least now the assumptions have been corrected. At least now Ryan Garcia can rest with honor restored, his memory no longer tainted by the lie that he ran away. The next time you hear about someone who disappeared, remember Ryan Garcia. Remember that assumptions can be wrong. Remember that the truth might be closer and simpler than the theories we construct. And remember that sometimes the answer is just 16 feet down, waiting for someone to look in the right place at the right time with the right tools.